So we are going to be continuing our review of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is turning the wheel of the Dharma. So last week we had a little introduction, talked a little bit about the history and the title, and this week we'll talk through the sutra and we'll see how far we get. And I'm going to mostly read the sutra. I'm going to skip some of the repetitive stuff, but I'm going to read it and then talk about it as we go through. Just to recap very quickly, this is described in the Vinaya, which is the monastic code, as Buddha's first sermon. There's some question about the historical accuracy of that, but that's the way it comes down to us. He, after leaving the palace, he went off and he sought out a couple of teachers. The first teacher, it was basically jhana practice, and he went up to the second or third base of nothingness of the immaterial jhanas. Wonderful, blissful, not liberation. Moved on. Next guy, fourth immaterial jhana. Wonderful, even more blissful, not liberation. Went off, figured it out on his own. There were the ascetics in the middle of it, and he went back and delivered this sermon to those guys. So the title is Turning the Wheel, and we'll get to that as we talk through the sutra. Wheel is important. The kind of teaching we're talking about here, where there are two different bodies. There's the four verbs. There's the four actions, which are understanding, release, abandoning, and developing. And then there's the three cycles of application of those verbs. This kind of compound teaching in Indian culture was called a wheel. Wheel is chakra, which we're all familiar with the chakras, right? So it's a word that's very important, and we talked about that some last week as well. So on to the sutra. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed a bunch of people. So standard formula, we need to know where, when, who was teaching, who he was talking to. It's just the standard opening formula. And we get a lot out of the opening formula. One thing we get out of this is the Blessed One. We don't talk about that a lot. The Blessed One, Bhagavan. Bhagavan is a term that is also used in the Sanatana Dharma to address Vishnu, to address Shiva. It is a term not just of appreciation and reverence, it's a term that's applied to deities and divinities. So this is something that we tend not to look at when we look at the Pali Canon, but it's in there. Buddha is actually being addressed in the same language that one would use to address Brahma, which is kind of interesting. I remember many years ago I was at an interfaith gathering, and there was somebody at the gathering who was a fairly senior, relatively younger, but senior guy in a Pure Land tradition. And it was very clear that he regarded Buddha as a god. And he was very resistant to the idea. I was very resistant to that idea. And he was resistant to the idea that Buddha was not a god, right? So it was, there's something there to pay attention to. And it actually, when you get into the Mahayana traditions, not addressed as a god, but there is something much more intentionally transcendent about the way Buddha is regarded. Buddha isn't just regarded as this dude who woke up. There's the Dharmakaya, which is Buddha as transcendent. It's an important part of that teaching. So that is something we don't look at, but I think it's kind of important. Bhikshus, these two extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What two? The pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering to either of these two extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. There's a lot that isn't in this sutta. It is one sutta, and to understand any of the teachings in the Pali Canon, you have to be willing to look outside any individual sutta, because one of the amazing things about this teaching, Buddha was a masterful rhetorician in his ability to play with language and look at linguistic puns and plays and double entendres was amazing. But he also was very much a verbal teacher, and he taught people where they were. And so there's a lot that isn't said. It's the handful of leaves. He taught what was useful, and he didn't teach the theory and the philosophy around it. There's the whole forest of leaves, and he teaches a handful. So there's necessarily a whole bunch of stuff that's not taught, and any one teaching is only one or two leaves out of that handful. You've got to go elsewhere to get the rest of them. That said, the two extremes should not be followed. Pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures. Many of the sutras begin the Anapanasati, the Satipatthana. We are looking at secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. So there's seclusion in here. There's seclusion in our practice, but yeah, okay. So there's seclusion in our practice from that, but there's nuances in here, right? Without veering to these extremes. So there's another sutra that I draw on, which is the Kaccayana Sutta. In the Kaccayana Sutta, Buddha is asked a question, and he describes existence and says that's not something to hold. And then he describes non-existence and says that's not something to hold. And he talks there about without veering to the two extremes. So this is one of those go left, go right, go right. If you're veering towards sensual pleasures, go right. If you're veering towards self-mortification, go left. If you're veering towards existence, non-existence, go left, go right. But this is not a compromise between two extremes. This is don't veer towards the extremes. This is a path that is separate from those extremes. Somebody described this to me as it's like there's a trapdoor. You open the trapdoor and you just drop through. It's a third way. It's a third way, and it's not a compromise. It's not this skillful balance. Because there has to be some level, renunciation is headed in that direction of, where it's headed towards unwholesome state, towards self-mortification. It's just not going the whole way there. The only reason self-mortification didn't work is because the body became too weak for concentration. So it's not finding the middle way between the extremes. It's called the middle way, but the middle way, we'll get to the middle way in a second, but it's not this compromise. Tathagata has awakened to the middle way. Tathagata, of course, is what the Buddha called himself. He never called himself Buddha in this. He called himself Tathagata, thus come one, thus gone one, which is a way of describing not being a being. It's a way of not identifying as something that is landed, consciousness that is landed on a state of becoming or a state of being. And he says, Tathagata has awakened to the middle way. Awakened to the middle way. It's not I've figured out the middle way. Awakened to the middle way. The middle way itself is what is awakened to. Right view, if you look in some of the definitions in the canon of right view. Right view in many places is described precisely as the Four Noble Truths, precisely as existent cause, cessation, path to cessation of suffering. So awakened to the middle way. This is, again, pointing at it's not a compromise. It's something really special. And waking up to that itself is really profound. That actually comes right back right at the end where somebody does understand. Which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, peace, direct knowledge, enlightenment, nibbana. Gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge. That is code for, there are the 6 knowledges, and it's really pointing at a couple of the knowledges. When Buddha woke up, there were the 6 knowledges. The 6th of them, which is the one he said, this is the one that matters, is the knowledge of how to end suffering. The Four Noble Truths. But the other knowledge is knowledge of all of his past lives. Absolute ability to see other people's minds. Pure, goodness, what's the word? Doesn't matter. But the ability to, clairvoyance. Clairvoyance was one of the knowledges. One of the other knowledges was the ability to know the destiny of every other being, so the karmic destiny, so what other beings were going to be, where they were headed in their next lives. So this vision and this knowledge, these are words that are used for that kind of insight into karma, one's own karma and the karma of others. So the karma associated with this sack of skin and bones and the karma associated with others. So again, it's much more there's more inaccessible stuff in it, culturally inaccessible stuff in here than we normally like to see, but that's all in here. Direct knowledge, enlightenment, nibbana. Nibbana, I've talked about before, but nibbana is associated with putting out a fire, but the word for clinging and the word for fuel, upadana, are the same word. So the fire, at that time, fire was one of the elements, one of the 4 elements, and fire clung to fuel. Fuel and clinging are both upadana. So you've got the same word. This is one of those skillful linguistic things our rhetorician is doing here. And when the fire is put out, the fire doesn't disappear. The fire isn't moved to non-existence. The fire is simply released from the fuel. So fire is an element. The fire is just out there. Fire is just out there as an element without landing on fuel. This is nibbana. Thanissaro, whose translations and whose insight into the canon I really, really appreciate, he uses the word unbinding as his translation here, which is indicative of that. It's still there, it's just not landed. And there's a couple of the sutras that talk about consciousness that does not land, which is pointing at the same thing. And what bhikkhus is that middle way, awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which leads to nibbana. It is this noble eightfold path, that is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This, bhikshus, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, etc. So the middle way, the way is, it's a path, it's a road, it leads somewhere. It is not the goal, we know this, it's the raft, but it's important that this is the path, it's not the destination. Paths lead us somewhere, and then they stop, and then we get there. So this is the path. There's this awaken to again. And then right, sama is the word for right. This is a word that people play around with a lot. And we can get really sophisticated around playing with the word right, but I'm increasingly of the mind that it's actually really simple. There's a lot of meditation practice out there. There's a lot of mindfulness practice out there that is used in the secular world. That is mindfulness and that's meditation, but it probably isn't right mindfulness. It probably isn't right meditation. Right in this sense means pointed in the direction of freedom. Right means being used in conjunction with the appropriate set of technologies, which are the other 7 steps here, and we're headed intentionally in the right direction. That to me is what right is about.
Would correct be a better word?
Correct implies right and wrong. Correct implies the alternative is wrong. It's yes. I think it's a better word than a lot of the things, by the words we use, but I'm trying to describe, without using synonyms, rather to describe what it's alluding to. And I think it's simply alluding to, it is the practice of right meditation. It's the practice of meditation that will lead to liberation. So it means constantly going back and revisiting, constantly going back with right mindfulness, right effort applied to your meditation to make sure it is headed in the right direction, bringing all the other steps in to reinforce the meditation practice, and constantly looking at where we're going. Is this skillful? Is this unskillful? Are we headed towards liberation or not? Now, bhikshus, this bhikshus is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. The 5 aggregates subject to clinging. This is another one which it's very easy to take that as more and less than it really is. It's not the 5 aggregates, it's the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. So the 5 aggregates is not a recipe for how to make a human being, is to get 3 of these and 2 of those, and we get the right mixtures of aggregates at the right temperatures, and we create a human being. Looking at the human being in terms of the aggregates is simply a way of looking at a human being and saying a human being is not an autonomous thing. A human being is made up of stuff. And the word for aggregates, the word for stuff, aggregate, also translates as trunk. It was landed as aggregates in a particular time in our industrial age where aggregate was a way of looking at heaps of stuff that we use to make things. Might not be the most skillful translation these days, because it's just simply a way of recognizing that we're made of stuff. And you can look at stuff, it's useful to look at stuff in these 5 categories. And form, when you look at this, there are the 32 body parts, and the first 5 are head hair, body hair, nails, teeth, and skin. And then you get to like muscles and tendons and so forth. But it's not saying you get 10 nails and 250,000 hairs and you stick them all together and you make a human being. Because separately he talks about putting things together and there's still something missing. It's a way of recognizing interdependence, really. And they're aggregates of clinging. They're not just stuff, they're aggregates of clinging. Birth is suffering. Birth, any kind of coming into existence. The most obvious birth alludes to the caste system. And wherever you land in the caste system, there's suffering. Wherever you land in the sack of skin and bones, there's suffering. But birth is basically any becoming. Aging, illness, death. These are the 3 things that he encountered when he first left the temple, first left the palace. Union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing. Not getting what we want. Self-envy. I'm going to pause there. I've been talking for about 20 minutes and I want to